Okay, we're moving on now to Chapter 13, which introduces the topic of begging the question. Begging the question is one of the most common fallacies that we have, and it occurs any time that we assume as true in the premises what we're supposed to be providing in the conclusion, or proving in the conclusion. Essentially, these tend to be circular arguments. In its simplest form, it would be as if I said, if I assume that A is true, it follows that A is true. Well, of course, that's obviously going to be the case, but it's not proving anything. Now, granted, the begging the question arguments are usually more complex and the assumptions are more cleverly hidden, but the formula basically holds as is. So begging the question is to assume as true in the premises the thing that you're supposed to be trying to prove in the conclusion. If we look at the example here, it says murder is morally wrong, therefore abortion is morally wrong. This person is making that type of claim because they want to argue against abortion. But here's the thing. One of the central questions within this topic is whether or not abortion is a form of murder or not. That is a very controversial issue that you have two sides very well entrenched in their views upon, with one group saying that it is, the other group saying that it isn't, talking about when life begins and so on. But the simple fact is that since that is an unsettled issue, you can't just draw this automatic link between murder and abortion. But that's what the argument is trying to do. So it is begging the question with regards to the question of abortion and whether or not it is murder or not. Okay. A very famous example of the begging the question fallacy is St. Anselm's ontological proof for the existence of God, found in his Proslogion. St. Anselm basically was asked to prove, or wanted to prove, the existence of God. And his argument effectively says that since God is that which nothing greater can be conceived, it follows that God exists. Well, that argument hinges very strongly upon our acceptance of his definition of God, right? God being that entity which is superior to all other beings. If we accept that definition that God is that which nothing greater can be conceived, then of course we're going to conclude that God exists, because if we start listing all the different attributes that make up God, all those positive things, all powerful, all loving, all knowing, etc., we have to include existence as one of those attributes. Otherwise, we could imagine something greater than God, namely something that has all of those attributes and actually exists. So the very fact it seems to be contained within, for Anselm, it seems to be contained within it, the concept that God is real, because we can't imagine anything greater or superior, and God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. But here's the problem. If you were trying to convince an atheist that God exists, and you said to that atheist, so what is the definition of God? That atheist is not going to say God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. That atheist is going to say something like, well, God is a fictional being that was created to control and manipulate the masses. And as soon as you use that argument, or that definition rather, the whole argument falls apart. Right? And so St. Anselm is begging the question by making that assumption that God is, that everyone accepts that definition, that God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. And as soon as you acknowledge that not everyone does accept that definition, just like not everyone accepts the definition of abortion as a form of murder, once you realize that, you see that the argument falls apart. And so in that respect, it's committing what we now call a begging the question fallacy. And so that's your basic form, your basic idea of a begging the question fallacy. We have within the category of begging the question some other variations upon it. And one of these that's mentioned in your book is what we call a self-sealing argument. A self-sealing argument is one that tries to keep the argument valid by changing or giving a very specific definition to a particular term. In other words, if somebody presents an argument to you, you take that argument and you evaluate that argument at its word. And if that person is able to counter your argument, you should be willing to acknowledge that fact. But what a person committing a self-sealing fallacy is doing is they will keep changing the definition. They'll keep changing a meaning so that they are able to keep their argument right. So, for example, a clergyman would never smoke, but Pastor Frank smokes, so he must not be a true clergyman. So the person makes the argument that a clergyman would never smoke. Well, okay, I present him with this counterexample. Here's a clergyman who does smoke. And so rather than admitting that, I must have been wrong, maybe some clergymen do, instead of taking a more moderate stance to his argument and saying, well, usually clergymen don't smoke. Instead of doing that, this person goes back and, insists that his definition is right. A clergyman is a person who doesn't smoke. Therefore, this Pastor Frank clearly isn't a real clergyman, because if he was, he wouldn't smoke. Okay? So we're trying to change the argument time and time again. There was an example of this in the book, if I can find it here, which is a very good one. Here it is on page 231. Let's see, where did it go? All right, yes, so here we are. A particularly proud Scotsman picks up the morning paper and reads that an Englishman has committed a horrendous sex crime. No Scot would do such a thing, our Scotsman exclaims. But the very next day he reads an account of the even more vicious and scandalous sex crime committed by Mr. Angus McSporran of Aberdeen, Scotland. Confronted with such a clear counterexample to his claim that no Scot would commit such a crime, our proud Scotsman ought to withdraw his claim, or at least retreat to the milder claim that very few Scotsmen would commit such a crime. But instead he saves his original claim. No true Scotsman would do such a thing. So, in other words, rather than admitting that he might be wrong, he questions the true Scottish nature of this individual accused of these sex crimes. So that's the idea behind a self-sealing fallacy. Again, I'm just changing the meaning. I'm changing the definition. I'm trying to insist so that I can keep my argument as being the truth. And again, this is always going to be a fallacy anytime that you try to commit this. The last variation that we have here is one of my favorites, and it's called the complex question. It's easy to spot because it's always taking the form of a question. But a complex question is a question that looks simple, but actually has a hidden assumption within it. On the surface, the complex question is going to look like a straightforward question requiring a singular answer. But when we look at it more closely, we find that there is a hidden assumption lurking behind that question. And so we look at the example on the screen. Have you stopped cheating on exams? It looks like a very simple, very straightforward yes or no response. But there's an implied question within that, which is, have you been cheating on exams? But by not acknowledging that fact, this becomes a way of trapping someone. Think about it. Have you stopped cheating on exams? If you say yes, then you've inadvertently admitted that you were cheating on the exams, and now you've stopped. Have you stopped cheating on exams? No. Well, you've just admitted that you have been and still are cheating on exams. There's no way in answering this directly as a yes-no type of question that you can deny being a cheater on exams. And so that's the idea. The complex question, it looks like a simple, straightforward thing, but there's a hidden question in there that really needs to be answered first. Before we get to this point, we need to raise the question, have you been cheating on exams? And then if you have you stopped? Okay. Perhaps a parent might ask an underage child, where did you hide that beer that you were drinking? Well, there's an underlying assumption that the child has been drinking. So regardless of how the child responds to the question, he's trapped into admitting that he was drinking. Okay? And so it becomes a way, again, of trapping individuals in one way or another, just trying to force them into admitting something that maybe they wouldn't ordinarily do. This becomes an important issue also within the courtroom. You may have heard of people talking about a leading question, right, in the courtroom. Well, ideally, you should not be doing that. You should offer a straight question. For example, you have someone up on the stands and you say to them, well, tell us, what did you see on the night of April 9th? That's a straight question. It's very open. It gives that person on the stand the opportunity to simply explain to you in their own words what it is that they saw on that particular evening. But many times the lawyer might say something like this. Tell us, on April 9th, did you see the defendant shoot the deceased? That's a leading question, because in a sense it is already assuming that the defendant is guilty of committing this crime. And it's simply trying to find out whether this person saw that individual shoot them or not. And of course, maybe the question is that this person did see someone with a gun, maybe did see someone shoot another individual, but maybe they were too far away, maybe the person was masked, there could be any number of things. But by facing it in that way, that lawyer is trying to get you to admit that it was this person who is on trial that you saw, when in reality, maybe you didn't. So, whether we're talking about a leading question in a courtroom, a complex question in the guise of logic, the fact is that we have to make sure that what we're asking is a straightforward question, not one that is intended to lead people astray, not one that has these inherent assumptions within them. And so all of these different forms of begging the question have some type of assumption. The straight begging the question fallacy, you're assuming the thing that you're supposed to be trying to prove as being true. With the complex question that we're looking at here, you're assuming something, a hidden question, has already been answered. And with the self-sealing fallacy, you're assuming that your stance, your definition, or what have you, is 100% correct. So that's the basic issue behind the begging the question fallacy. So if we go to page 236, section 13-1, we will find some problems here, and the idea is we're supposed to find out whether what's being said is a begging the question of some sort, or whether it is a legitimate argument. So number one, it says some skeptics claim that people who report seeing flying saucers are not really careful observers, and probably were mistaken about what they thought they saw. But in fact, people who report seeing flying saucers are careful observers. For if they weren't careful observers, they wouldn't have seen the flying saucers at all, now would they? Well, that's clearly a begging the question fallacy. The argument that's being made here, it's saying that, some skeptics claim that people who report seeing flying saucers are not careful observers. But this person counter-responds by saying, well, wait a minute, they are careful observers, because if they weren't, they would have seen they wouldn't have seen the flying saucers. But there is an assumption here that this person really did see the flying saucer in order to make that. And so you'll notice that what you have is a big circular argument that's being presented that doesn't actually get you anywhere. And again, you have that assumption that this person really did see them. It's not a question of their sanity or their vision or anything else. It's an assumption that this person really did see what they claim to have seen. So that is a begging the question fallacy. Number 2, we must place some limit on the amount of money a candidate can be allowed to spend in a political campaign, since unlimited spending by political candidates must be stopped. That also would be a begging the question fallacy. And really, the problem here is that the statement that's being made in the premise is identical, just stated in a different way, to what's stated in the conclusion. We have to place a limit on the amount of money a candidate is allowed to spend. That says exactly the same thing as unlimited spending by political candidates must be stopped. There's no difference between them. Well, if that's the case, then there's no argument being put forward. It's simply a restatement. So once again, if A is true, it follows that A is true. That doesn't prove anything. That's not an argument. That is begging the question as well. Be a begging the question synonymous form. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and let you guys try some more of these. So here on page 236 for homework, please do 3 through 10. Again, just indicating whether they are fallacies, what type of fallacy, or whether it is a legitimate argument. All right. Any questions, feel free to email or write to the discussion board. And have a great day.